Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to talk about something that I've been wanting to talk about actually since I started this channel, and that is about F1's lost generation. So obviously we're in the middle of a pretty intense title fight right now between Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. I know the gap's about 40 points, and just for reference, I'm recording this video in the middle of the Brazilian Grand Prix weekend. So these stats are basically up to date to basically the beginning of that weekend. But obviously, both of those drivers relatively young. Max Verstappen born 1997, Lando Norris born 1999. And if you can, for example, look at all of F1's world champions all the way back from the very, very beginning of F1, and you line them up based on birth year, there's actually some interesting trends. So these are your 33, 34 world champions, I believe, all the way from the oldest, which is Farina, to the youngest, Max Verstappen. And if you look at the age gaps between all of those drivers, so there's three sets of arrows, and basically those are all gaps of 8 years between world champions. There's a gap between Ascari and Brabham, there's a gap between Hill and Hakkinen, and then there's also a gap between Villeneuve and Raikkonen. Those gaps are all 8 years, but there's one gap that's 10 years, and that's the biggest gap in F1 history in terms of age, between world champions, and that is between Sebastian Vettel, who was born in 1987, and Max Verstappen, the reigning triple world champion, who was born in 1997. And I think at this point in time, we obviously had, a period of time during the summer break where perhaps it looked like Daniel Ricciardo was basically on his way back to Red Bull, but of course he's basically out of F1 likely for good at this point. And with how many drivers who are left on the grid from this entire generation, looks like all of them could be out of a seat at the end of the season. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. And I've basically made the cutoff 1988 to 1994. So for example, while there are drivers who are slightly older than Max Verstappen who are on the grid, who I think are very good drivers, I don't think any of these drivers are going to be world champion. And that includes drivers like Carlos Sainz, Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon, and Alex Albon, because they were all drivers who are older than Verstappen, but I think realistically none of those four drivers are going to be world champion, especially given that none of them are going to be in front-running machinery anytime soon. And on the other end of the spectrum, you also have drivers who are basically a little bit too old for the time range that I was looking at. So when people talk about F1's lost generation, this generation of drivers I'm talking about for today's video, they will often mention Nico Hülkenberg, for example. But turns out Nico Hülkenberg was actually born in 1987, which is the same year as Sebastian Vettel. So I'm not including him in this video, and there's a couple others as well. Paul di Resta, Roman Grosjean, Kamui Kobayashi, all born in 1986. And then you, of course, have Robert Kubica, a little bit older, 1984. Although, of course, he's basically closer in age to, for example, your Hamiltons and your Rosbergs, who were both born in 1985. So the first driver I want to talk about is going to be Daniel Ricciardo, of course. So born 1989, his F1 career started in 2011 with that mid-season call-up to HRT, and it unofficially ended at the Singapore Grand Prix this year in 2024. As for recording of this video, he had 258 Grand Prix, 8 wins, 32 podiums, 3 pole positions. I also want to talk about the best car that each of these drivers had, as well as perhaps some missed opportunities to perhaps have been in a better car. So for Ricciardo, I basically did this based on average minimum finishing position, which is a stat that I like to use to talk about how good a car is in both qualifying and in the races. And for Ricciardo, his best car was the 2016 Red Bull with a 2.67 average minimum finishing position. And now for Ricciardo, he was obviously always been talked about as a guy who's very, very quick, but he was simply at that top seat in Red Bull at the wrong point in time, just when they were falling off their kind of dominance in the early 2010s, of course, where Vettel won 4 straight drivers' championships, and he never really had an opportunity to compete for a drivers' championship because arguably his best years, 2014, 2016, the Mercedes was basically untouchable. He then goes to a bunch of different teams, leaves Red Bull because of the perceived threat of Max Verstappen. And I think realistically speaking, if he had stayed at Red Bull for all these years leading up till 2021, where Verstappen had his first title fight, realistically he still doesn't end up, I think, fighting for that title. So I think really for Ricciardo, his best bet, honestly, it's kind of weird to say this, but his best bet I think would have perhaps been potentially replacing Rosberg at Mercedes when Rosberg retired. Don't think that was ever really a realistic option. Or if F1 history had gone a little bit differently, if, for example, Mark Webber had retired a year earlier, which would have forced Red Bull to promote someone, either Jean-Eric Vergne or Daniel Ricciardo from Toro Rosso a year sooner. And I also want to talk about some kind of more advanced statistics I've kind of calculated as well. So in Ricciardo's case, I have my two models. I have my race model and my qualifying model. I like to keep them separate because I think they're slightly different disciplines. But, race model ranking, Ricciardo ranks 9th. Qualifying ranking, Ricciardo ranks in 7th. And this is from all drivers from 2008 till 2023. Haven't included the 2024 data yet, obviously, as the season hasn't finished yet. But quite clear, Ricciardo's a very, very good driver, and I think probably, without a doubt, the best driver from his generation. F1 just didn't have the chance. And also looking at the expected points model, his career expected points percentage in terms of how many points he got above expected or below expected, he ended up with 111% of his expected points, so definitely above 100%, which is a good thing. In terms of his class, so basically the class rank is how many points a driver got in their career divided by how many seasons they got, just because the model works, the percentages and stuff work in very, very strange ways, depending on if you were in a front-running car for most of your career, if you were in a midfield car, or if you were in a back marker for most of your career. So for Ricciardo, he accrued enough time in front-running cars that he's in the kind of the front-running class. And so he was actually ranked third in that group of 15 drivers. Overall, he ranks 7th out of 78, so still very, very good totals there. And you can see in the graph his best years, according to that model, 2014 and 2017. This model, I've changed it so it now accounts for mechanical reliability, which is a big issue that I thought it had with the previous one. But generally, all in all the numbers really suggest that Ricciardo was a very, very good driver, just unfortunately never really had the car to compete for a title. The next driver I want to talk about is Valtteri Bottas, a guy who has similar stats career-wise: 244 Grand Prix, including this weekend, 10 wins, 67 podiums, 20 pole positions, and his best car statistically was the 2020 Mercedes, with an average minimum finishing position of 1.24. And of course, for Bottas, born in 1989, same year as Ricciardo, F1 career, started 2 years later, started 2013 with Williams, of course, still going, and it's kind of up in the air whether it's going to end at the end of this year or if it's going to continue into 2024. But for Bottas, one problem that he definitely hasn't had, that Ricciardo definitely had, was the car. Bottas drove the Constructors' Championship winning Mercedes from 2017 all the way till 2021. They, of course, won the Constructors that final year, although they didn't win the drivers. So the one thing that you can say about Bottas is he definitely had the opportunity to compete for world championships in the right machinery, but unfortunately had an extremely talented, all-time great teammate in Lewis Hamilton that really prevented him from ever really being able to compete for the championship. He did, of course, finish second in the championship twice, in 2019 and in 2020. Now, when you look at the advanced stats for Bottas, race model ranking not great, 30th, and I think there's about 60 drivers total who qualified for this, so basically average. Qualifying model ranking 10th, so a little bit below Ricciardo, and top 10 as well, so still very, very good qualifier, and I think that kind of matches with what people's perception of Bottas is as a driver. Expected points model, not fantastic. His career tally is 93%. Class rank, so same class as Bottas, 11th out of 15 drivers, and his overall rank is 46. So always very, very good over one lap, kind of across his career. 10 pole positions and ranks 10th in my quality model. Again, on a Sunday, he does leave a little bit to be desired. And when you look at the graph, for example, you can see his years at Williams, mostly positive. the years at Mercedes, definitely big negatives there. I forgot to explain this last time, but basically on the graph, if it's red, it's a front-running car. If it's blue, it's a midfield car. And if it's yellow, it's like a back marker car. All right, so moving on to the third driver I want to talk about. And of course, this is a driver who obviously has a lot of asterisks involved to him. So Jules Bianchi, born 1989, F1 career much shorter than it really should have been. Drove in F1 from 2013 to 2014. Of course, had that terrible accident at the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix. The total Grand Prix is 34, 2 points, which were both at the 2014 Monaco Grand Prix. And best car, it was a pretty terrible car. It was the 2014 Marussia with an average score of a 14.81. I'm going to go over the advanced stats, and then of course I'm going to talk about a bit more about Bianchi. But for Bianchi, he does not included in the race model ranking or the quality model ranking because his only teammate in F1, Max Chilton, never had any other teammates in F1, and neither did he. So basically, because I use teammate head-to-head relationships for both those models, I can't really put both of them in, and something I'm considering changing in the future. But for this iteration of the model, at least there, it's both basically an NA for both of them. In terms of expected points, very, very good. 741%. Class rank is third, and overall rank is 9th out of 78 drivers. So despite the fact he was driving a very, very bad car, he still did very, very well in this model because of those 2 points he scored in a very poor Marussia. And of course, for Bianchi, his career was obviously cut short very, very much too soon. And of course, talking about all these hypotheticals about how good of a driver he was, what would he have done if he was in a better car? It's always kind of surrounded by the fact that he died much too soon, and obviously it was a massive tragedy at the time. I was reading his Wikipedia page recently, basically for this video, and there's quite a few quotes from the CEO of Ferrari at the time, basically saying, "Oh, Jules was a big part of our future. He, of course, was a member of the Ferrari Driver Academy, but basically, he would have been a Ferrari driver one day." And obviously, this accident happened 10 years ago now, but basically, these are always things that are often said after the death of a very big public figure, whether it be in F1 or be in any other sport. And yeah, so obviously with Bianchi, it's very, very hard to tell what he could have done in a better car. I have no doubt he would have been a very, very good driver, and I think shown a lot more than he basically could have in the Marussias he's driven. But at the same time, very, very hard to say what his top end ceiling would have been in terms of potential. Could he have won a world championship? Could he have been a race winner? That kind of thing, very, very difficult to ascertain. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that we'll, of course, never know. So on that note, moving on to drivers not born in 1989, moving to the next year, 1990. And that first driver I want to talk about is Sergio Perez, of course, still in F1, but lots of noise at the moment as of the recording of this video about what might happen basically in the coming weeks with regards to 2025. So F1 career is just 2011 to present, 282 Grand Prix, 6 wins, 39 podiums, 3 pole positions, and the best car he's driven is the 2023 Red Bull without a doubt. Average minimum finishing position of 1.05. And for Bottas, in terms of being able to be a world champion, very similar discussion to Valtteri Bottas. He's definitely driven very good cars, but he had the very, the unfortunate luck, or bad luck, I should say, to be up against a all-time great teammate in Max Verstappen, just like Valtteri Bottas was up against Lewis Hamilton. Obviously, he was always talked about as a guy who's very good midfield driver during his time at Force India and Racing Point, and I think was a little bit fortunate with the circumstances of Red Bull at the time that he was able to get that seat at Red Bull for 2021. Never really, I think, honestly speaking, never made the most of that opportunity, given that he's been so far off the pace of his teammate Max Verstappen, but obviously still has picked up 3 pole positions and I think 5 wins, because obviously he got the 1 as Racing Point. Now, his advanced stats are not fantastic. race model ranking 26, quality model ranking 21st. Expected points model also not great, but 87%. But if you basically looked at just the time in the midfield at Racing Point Force India, data was very, very good. It's basically these 3 years that Red Bull have really tanked his scores. So expected points 87%, class rank 12th out of 15, and overall rank 49th out of 78. So not great on those points. All right, so a couple more drivers to go through. Jean-Eric Vergne, born 1990, F1 career 2012 to 2014. He had 58 Grand Prix, scored 51 points, and his best car was the 2014 Toro Rosso with an average minimum finishing position of 9.84. And of course, he was Daniel Ricciardo's teammate at the time that he was in F1. Of course, also a teammate of Danny Kvyat. When you look at the advanced stats, though, it's quite a odd picture. So he was never a great qualifier in F1. The quality model ranking backs that up. He ranks 36 there, but the race model ranks him very, very high in 12th. And the expected points model is also very, very favorable to him. Percentage of expected points, 124%. First in his class, so he's in the midfield driver class, and he actually ranks first out of 33 drivers there with an overall ranking of 4th. So he does extremely well on that model, and it kind of all of the data generally suggests that he was a very, very good driver on Sunday. Qualifying was just not quite there, and I think he's a slightly bigger driver as well, similar to Nico Hülkenberg, and I really feel like, for example, with Hülkenberg, he's blossomed quite a bit since he came back to F1 in 2023 and has kind of really shown some great results in qualifying, despite the fact that he's quite a bit older. And I do wonder if the weight rule changes that came in, I think 2019, have really helped some of those bigger drivers. And I do wonder if, for example, if Jean-Eric Vergne had been able to benefit from those results, if those results were in place. If those rules were in place when he was in F1, if he would have, had better results in qualifying, as I know he definitely struggled with, like food-related issues and like keeping his weight down, I think, as well. So unfortunately, another guy who kind of got dumped out of F1 very early. He was. I was looking at this. So for 2014, for his last season. Red Bull signed Verstappen that summer to their junior program. They confirmed him and Verstappen and Kvyat for Toro Rosso for 2015 that summer. And then a couple months later, Vettel basically announced he was joining Ferrari, and then that forced Red Bull to promote one of their drivers. They, of course, promoted Kvyat, but then they decided they didn't want to go back on their decision to drop Vergne, so they basically brought in Carlos Sainz instead. So quite unfortunate for Vergne, and then just never got back into F1, but he has had a very successful career in Formula E. Definitely nothing to be ashamed of. And in fact, the only double world champion in Formula E. So, moving on to Kevin Magnussen. So 184 Grand Prix for Magnussen, no wins, one podium. That podium, of course, came at his very first Grand Prix, the 2014 Australian Grand Prix. One pole position, Brazilian Grand Prix a couple years ago, and his best car, for better or worse, was his very first one in F1, the 2014 McLaren, with an average minimum finishing position of 5.79. Really up and down F1 career. For Magnussen, it really feels like he was unfortunately joined McLaren at the worst time. Basically as they were going downwards and basically trending towards their Maconda years, the bad ones. And he also is kind of a similar situation to Sainz this year. He was basically dropped, not necessarily because he was performing awful, but because an extremely good driver was coming in to replace him. As of course, Fernando Alonso rejoined McLaren that year, basically for 2015, and that left Magnussen without a seat. He of course would rejoin the following year with Renault, and then of course join Haas, where he had couple pretty good years, but he's never really shown results in F1 that have really, warranted a move up to a front running team, and the advanced stats kind of suggest that as well. So race model ranking 34th, so about somewhere in the middle. Quality model ranking 30th, and the expected points model was in a kind of similar situation where he's just kind of a little bit below average. Percentage of expected points 91%, class rank 14th out of 33 drivers, and overall rank 32nd out of 78 drivers. And you can basically see when you look at the graph, for example, he had that 1 year at McLaren where he had a massive negative, where he definitely kind of underperformed what he was expected to get based on his qualifying results. And then his years at Haas were generally pretty good, slightly above average, except for this past year, 2023. I think we're up to the last driver now. I'm hoping that is. Yes, so the last driver I want to talk about, 1992 birthday, Stoffel Vandoorne. He's kind of in this weird, awkward spot where he's kind of in the middle of the two generations, and he obviously started his F1 career quite late, starting in 2016. 42 Grand Prix for Vandoorne, 26 points. His best car was the 2018 McLaren with an 8.76 average finishing position. Again, very, very hard. I think harsh is probably the best way to go about it, in the sense that he, of course, was paired with Fernando Alonso, who's an extremely difficult driver to have as your teammate. And for example, when you look at teammate comparisons with Alonso versus his other teammates in F1, Vandoorne actually compared relatively well in qualifying, for example. So I think for Vandoorne, he was in a very unfortunate position where he was driving a very poor, unpredictable car, and he had an exceptional driver as his teammate. And the advanced stats, however, are not so kind in general. Race model ranking 28th, quality model ranking 39th. Expected points model, not great, 66%. Class rank 29th out of 33 drivers, and overall rank 51st out of 78. The 2017 season, not bad, but the 2018 season was definitely not very good. Definitely left quite a few points on the board according to the model. So there you go. There's the, I think, 6 drivers or so that I talked about of kind of F1's lost generation guys who I felt like were generally the best drivers in that group overall. There are some other drivers as well that I didn't mention, but I felt they weren't really that good enough to kind of warrant inclusion in this video. And I think realistically speaking, for example, if Perez gets dropped at the end of the year, if Bottas doesn't get re-signed by Sauber, you could basically have this entire generation of drivers. There's none of them left in F1, whereas your Hamilton's still going, Hulkenberg's still going, Alonso's still going as well. So really, really interesting point, I think, and this is a video that I kind of wanted to talk about. Now, who do you think probably had the biggest missed opportunity in F1? So, for example, do you think Vandoorne was treated a little bit harshly? Do you think Ricciardo should have made maybe different career moves? Would that have helped him be F1 champion? What do you think? So, anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.